everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today we are going to look at and ask the very controversial question of whether or not critical race theory is the logical extension of the civil rights movement. Now, I think many of you are used to discussing these issues, and we see it in society, and we know how it's projected. But what I want to do today is I want to answer that question by saying no. Actually, CRT fundamentally undermines the civil rights movement at nearly every level. So what I want to do today is I want to give you a very quick definition of what is CRT, look exactly at what they're trying to do in society, and then give you some very specific ways that it undermines the civil rights movement. Now, one of the reasons that we do this is because so many people are asking me this question, because the way that it's framed in education and in society and in maybe your church or within your friend circle is that we are just maintaining this long march towards justice in society. But what I think you need to see here is that they're actually undermining all of these claims for justice or racial reconciliation, all under this guise of they're actually maintaining and fulfilling social justice and reconciliation in society. So what I want to do here is I want to start out with a very quick definition of what do we mean by critical race theory. And the book that I'm getting this from is titled Race Marxism by James Lindsay. And James Lindsay is probably the world expert on this topic. And here's how he defines this movement. He says critical race theory is the belief that racism that benefits white people, namely white supremacy, is the fundamental organizing principle of society and that it is very bad. Now, notice what he's trying to get at here. When he's looking at this idea, he's trying to give us a very specific definition of critical race theory. Look specifically at this notion, that it's the belief that racism that benefits white people, this concept of white supremacy. So you're going to constantly hear people talking about how we need to rid ourselves of whiteness, how whiteness is the cause of this, and that it's sometime in some way axiomatic to what's bringing about the problems of our society. Now, let's pull it back up here again. And he's going to say that it's not only just this, that it's benefiting white people, the white supremacy, but that it's a fundamental organizing principle of society. This means that it's something that's essential to society. It's essential to our legal makeup and frameworks. It's essential to the way that we buy and sell. It's essential to the way that education operates. It's essential to virtually everything. So what do we have to do within the realms of critical race theory is that we have to rid people of this essential organizing principle. Namely, you have to eradicate whiteness. So what becomes fundamental is understanding people according to their racial makeup. Now, what's of great interest to many of us here is that we're asking this question, is CRT antithetical or in contradiction with the civil rights movement? And I would actually have to say yes. It's not actually the logical extension of it because it actually contradicts it in every sense of the term. So we remember what Martin Luther King Jr. sought to do. He wanted to judge people according to the content of their character and not according to the color of their skin. Whereas critical theorists have worked to actually flip that entire script. So one of the things that you're going to find is that during the civil rights movement, many of these critical theorists were participating in the movement, not because they were really up for, Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision for what he saw in civil rights. Rather, they saw an opportunity to actually push their view further along in society. So one of the examples that people would give is they would start to talk about, based off of our humanity, our common humanity, the fact that maybe we're all made in the image of God, some kind of very fundamental structure to who we are, that we have these inalienable rights and that we should all be treated equally before the law. And because we should have this equality before the law and it should in turn represent itself into society, we should have this civil rights movement. And I think anybody who's actually studied these issues would recognize that's a very valid understanding of the way that we should look at society. When we judge people according to the fact that they're all made in the image of God, that they're fundamentally human by their very definition and essence, that there's inalienable rights given to them. But here's what I want you to see. Critical race theorists don't actually believe that. And that's why they start to make these distinctions between I am a man versus, say, something, I am a black man. Now, notice what comes first and foremost. You're going to say, because of my humanity, I have these rights, or because I am a human, I have these concepts. You're using this essentializing principle of humanity. It's something that we all have in common. Whereas many critical theorists want to put their race as the common thing or the main differential that we must recognize all of society according to. So if race is the main means by which you must be understood, well, then fundamentally, racism is the lens by which we must interpret everything. So that brings us back to this whole initial notion here of, well, what is critical race theory? Critical race theory is the belief that racism that benefits white people, white supremacy, is the fundamental organizing principle of society, and that this is very bad. The reason that it's very bad is because they're going to say, look at all the inequities that happen. You're going to see these acts of racism or disparities between different people groups, and because of that, we should eradicate whiteness and all the factors that are coming into society today. So what I want you to see is that it's not just this idea of critical race theory that they're using. The whole thing is this long march towards an end goal. And Lindsay lays this out very clearly in the book, Race Marxism. But what I want you to see here is that all of these concepts that they're going to give us, this whole notion of social justice or diversity, equity, inclusion, and all of these things, they're going to say, in one sense, well, these are the means by which we should undo the white supremacy in our society. Now, unfortunately, many people either naively or for whatever means, I really don't want to judge motives here, have wrongly read that by these terms, they're actually meaning what maybe the civil rights leaders would have meant by that. So what they do is they take the civil rights movement and they see issues that happen maybe with Jim Crow, and they read all of that into what's going on today. And they're going to say, you know, we need to have a diverse society. We need to have a just society. We need to have people treated equally before the law. But what they don't understand is that these movements are fundamentally different at their core. What the whole issue of critical race theory is, it's to gin up a critical consciousness where you have these two groups, the concept of oppressed and oppressor, but now because race must be fundamental and essential to the entire conversation, what it does is they put race at the forefront. So now the disparities aren't between just, you know, an oppressor and the oppressed. It's because one holds a particular race that makes them the oppressor, and another group, usually black people, hold their fundamental race, and therefore they're oppressed. So what I want us to see here is that the next move of it is once this critical consciousness has been sort of put into the mindsets of people, the other side of critical theory must start to work its way out. And this is what's known as critical praxis. Now, critical praxis is something that we find in its historic Marxist roots. Marxism is one of theory and praxis, whether it's going to be in, you know, liberation theories, and whether it's in education, say, you know, Black liberation theology, where the whole goal of them is to have this revolution in which we're going to liberate sort of society in this regard, or it could be other things related to education, where you're going to see this critical consciousness is brought in, and therefore disparaging groups are liberated or freed from the moments and the different oppressions that they're in. But what we find here is that particularly as it relates to critical race theory, the praxis that they want you to do is to become an anti-racist. And to many, anti-racism just means, well, you're fighting racism. Every time you see racism, you're going to be against it or anti in that regard. And what they're trying to say is that critical race theorists is that when you have this critical consciousness, sort of the litmus test of whether or not you've bought into it fully is whether or not you're putting anti-racism practice into work. Now, here's what usually happens is that many of them are going to say, well, this is just merely making racism known. And while that may sound nice and very simple on the surface, it ends up being much more. And unfortunately, just as many people sort of naively bought into a very simple understanding of the relationship between CRT and the civil rights movement, many people bought into a very naive understanding of exactly what is anti-racism and how that might relate to the civil rights movement. So what I want to do here is I want to pull up an article that I found that talks about this in very specific ways. Now, what this article does here is it's titled here, it's really coming about how to be an anti-racist. And it comes by Ibram Kendi, and it gives this quote here. But what you need to see here is that the two speakers and the two writers on this, notice what they say here, the setup. The only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. So notice this, right in the very beginning is that you must be able to identify it. Well, how do you identify it? You put on the critical consciousness. And then how do you dismantle it? By doing anti-racism work or revolution work. Now, it goes on to say that this concept, that is the essence of anti-racism, the action that must follow both emotional and intellectual awareness of racism. And then it says, Kendi sits down with journalist Jamil Hill to explore what an anti-racist society might look like, how we can play an active role in building it, what being an anti-racist in your own context might mean. So it gives us these 5 basic ways of what it means to be an anti-racist. So first of all, he says this, you're either racist or anti-racist. There's no such thing as not racist. So fundamental to this idea is that an anti-racist doesn't look at somebody in a colorblind, neutral society. You always have to look at people either as the fact that they're a racist or they're an anti-racist. Or another way we could actually put it is that you can't be colorblind. You can't just try to say, I want to look at the character of a person or the content of a person's character. Rather, you're always reading things through the color of their skin. So this idea of you are always a racist or an anti-racist. Now, here's the interesting thing, is that according to this theory, especially if you're white, you're always a racist, but it's whether or not you've added on anti-racism. So notice what he goes on to say here. He goes on to claim that there's no such thing as not being racist. He even explains that even inaction, simply being not racist in the face of racism, is in fact a form of racism. The idea of an innocent bystander is wishful thinking for Kendi. Instead, there's only racism and anti-racism. So notice this, just because you don't do racist things doesn't mean that you're not a racist, according to him. You have to specifically do anti-racist work. So he goes on to say, if racism means both racist action and an inaction in the face of racism, then anti-racism means active participation in combating racism in all of its forms. So you must do critical praxis. In addition, they say, we need to flip the script on the roots of racism. Now, notice what it says here. Most people think the roots of racism are ignorance and hate, says journalist Jamil Hill. But after extensive research on structural and attitudinal racism, notice this fundamental, essential property that's in every realm, legal, educational, societal, fiscal, and all these different things, Kendi has a very different way of understanding what, or more accurately, who produces racism. Groundswells of racism don't produce racism policies. In fact, it's the other way around. Those in power use racism to justify their policies, wielding the emotive power of ignorance and hate as tools at their disposal. So just remember this. One of the fundamental features of this sort of critical theory is that not only should we view everything in terms of race, but we should view everything in terms of power dynamics. So notice that's why he's trying to say here, those who have the power will actually put it into place. So that's really what's of interest, is that, historically we would try to say, somebody was a racist if they were being bigoted or showing some kind of, bias against an individual. But that's not what these figures believe. They believe racism is both this idea of bias plus power that's coming about. So you can be biased against people, but unless you have the power to put it into place, well, then, you're not truly a real racist in their regard. So that's how they actually try to skirt themselves from, well, you're just reverse racism because, we can't be racist because we don't have the power to be racist. Now let's continue looking here. They go on to say, and why would somebody rally the masses around racism? It all comes back to good old self-interest, according to Kendi's research. It's a craven calculation, but if someone wants to get elected, add to their profit margins, or just raise their profile, racism has consistently proven helpful. So what they're trying to look at here is that we have to flip the whole script on the roots of racism. They're going to say part of it is that it's a fundamental fact that some people have power. So how do you get rid of racism? What does it mean to be an anti-racist? You must speak into power. Well, what's the goal of speaking into power? It's necessarily to remove those who are in power and their policies. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to remove this essential notion of whiteness or white supremacy in society. And if that's somehow essential to society, once you undo it, well, then what are you doing? You're getting a new society. What does that sound like? Revolution towards a new utopia in which we don't have racism anymore? That's why James would specifically call this a form of race Marxism. So then you might be asking questions within this race Marxism concept of, well, why are conversations about race so unproductive? Now, notice what they go on to look at is that most conversations, it says here, people want to know why conversations about race and racism are so unproductive. Now, just listen to what they have to say here, just real quickly.
So why are these conversations that we try to have about race, why are they so unproductive?
Oh man, where's my
Yeah, I know. Just get your book out and just start reading it right up here. Yeah.
So I think first and foremost, this isn't in any sort of order. I think you have everyone imagine themselves as the expert on race because they're racialized. And so what happens is we even, for instance, have difficulty talking about medicine. At the same time, we recognize there's a such thing as medical researchers and doctors, right? So can you imagine if, generally speaking, we didn't even consider doctors to have expertise, how difficult it would be for us to sort of have a conversation, a difficult conversation about medicine. And with that being said, part of the difficulty is you have so many people who refuse to accept their diagnosis.
So what's his diagnosis? The diagnosis is very clear. The reason you don't like having conversations about race and racism is because you don't see that you're a racist. So how do you become an anti-racist? You must admit your racism in order to have the conversation. But isn't that sort of, in many respects, begging the question? You're assuming that their conclusion is true in this regard, and you're smuggling that into your basic premises. Isn't the whole point to prove that people are racist, not to assume that they are racist? But notice this, it functions like an axiom, is that it's a self-referential axiom. You are a racist because you have power, and if you admit that you're racist, you're going to see your racism. But if you don't admit that you're a racist, well, it's because you're, a conscious or unconscious racist. And the cycle just continues on and on again. So fundamentally, how do you become an anti-racist? You assume your racism. How do you have conversations with people? You get them to assume their racism. Why? Because pervasive to their entire theory is the fact that all of society must be viewed racially according to modes of power, and those powers bring disparities. Hence, the disparities are your either conscious or unconscious racism. Now, one of the things is they are going to ask, well, how a strategy to undermine racism is backfired? It goes on to say, one of the most popular strategies used by Black communities to fight back against racism has been backfired, says Kendi. Respectability politics have long been the go-to tactic for Black communities, having been implemented by white abolitionists and passed down for generations. The subtext of respectable policies, argues Kendi, is that Black people are partially responsible for the racist ideas directed at them because of how they act. This popular tool used for centuries to combat racism, therefore, is itself racist. And Kendi says this is an example of how convoluted discussions of race, even within the Black community, have become. Now, notice what he says. respectable policies aim to counter stereotypes by visibly embodying their antithesis. If you're seen acting respectably, they'll respect you. Members of stereotype minority groups use respectability politics to create a positive counter narrative, but critics say it's not an oppressed group's responsibility to answer for their own oppression. So one of the reasons that they would say, have this inability to move it along is because we're allowing white people to set the agenda. We must act white. We must talk white. We must, in many respects here, be the good person that they call us to be. And because of this, we're in many respects being counterproductive because we are in many respects fighting the enemy on the enemy's ground according to the enemy's rules and according to their enemy's ways. So how do you fight this if you're an anti-racist? You don't do this. You don't have to follow these internalized sort of responsibility categories that they call you to. You get to have new categories because remember, you can't undo the old oppressive idea and regime according to the old oppressive ideas rules. The regime needs to have new rules. Well, what are those new rules? The ones set down by critical theory and those set down by their revolution that they're bringing about for their anti-racist society. So the final one here is that we must confront internalized racism. It goes on to say an audience question about internalized racism is Black communities prompts Ibram Kennedy to call for people of color in positions of power to step up in the fight for anti-racism. Now listen to what he says here, just real quick.
There's been pushback among Black folk in particular about this idea that we can internalize racism too. What I've found is some of the most forceful pushback has been Black people in positions of power. And the reason why they've pushed back is because the way it's currently sort of conceived, when a Black person gets in a position of power and reproduces and maintains the same anti-Black racist policies as their white predecessors, and they defend those policies with the same racist ideas as their white predecessors, we certainly don't call them racist in the way we did their white predecessors. So in anything, because of the color of their skin, they're given a pass, which then allows them, right, to continuously do that, which is why they're actually empowered in those positions in the first place. And
so notice, one of the reasons that he's claiming that people who are of color are in these positions is because in many respects, they just went along with the agenda. And in order to keep their job, they've maintained the fundamental thoughts and ideologies of whiteness in that job policy place.
they imagine that all they essentially have to do is sit in those positions, because if they do, they're a credit to the race. But if we say, no, it's not enough for you to sit in those positions, that you have the power to either further racist or anti-racist policies, what are you going to do? It puts them in a completely different situation that they don't.
Do you see the situation that they're putting themselves in? Not only do they want people of color to sit in the chair, but they want people, once they get the power, to specifically do anti-racism when they're in that chair. And that's one of the fundamental things, is that whenever you find a diversity, equity, and inclusion, or a diversity program, or the different chairs of it, it's not that they just want the presence of it there. The goal is theory and praxis. The practice is to completely dismantle and disrupt whatever system they have in place. Let's continue here.
Want to be in, right? And so I think that people in positions of power, Black people or people of color more broadly in positions of power, need to, obviously, if they're going to be anti-racist, ensure that they are pushing and defending policies that create more racial equity.
So look at what's being said here. Let's come back here real quick on some of this. So we've seen in so many respects what it means to be, quote, an anti-racist, and what they mean by anti-racism. Now, here's what I want you to see, is that this is specifically what critical race theory is trying to do. They're trying to do this whole notion of where you're going to obtain a critical consciousness, and you're going to get people on board with seeing a critical consciousness. And when you have this critical consciousness, you're going to fulfill all of the maxims of what they were trying to say. Namely, you're either a racist or an anti-racist. You need to start flipping the scripts on historic narratives. You need to realize why all of the other conversations have been so unproductive as they relate to race, and this concept of internalized racism and why it's backfired. So when you have all of this critical consciousness that's been put into place, you have the theories that can then be put into praxis. Hence, putting critical theory into praxis is specifically what has been going on for the last several years. So all of the diversity issues that you've seen, all of the HR departments, what they're trying to do is that the critical consciousness here via race is now working towards its next aspect, which is the revolutionary concepts of classic critical theory. And you must wear the glasses to see racism everywhere. And once you see the racism everywhere, you must work to disrupt and dismantle all of the power dynamics that are within racist structures in order to fundamentally undo what's going on. So now let's close up here with the final section. And what I want you to see here is I want to give you a few reasons on why we should actually say CRT is not the logical extension of the civil rights movement. The first one is that Martin Luther King wanted people to be judged according to the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Whereas this movement is fundamentally opposed to it because they ask that we always judge people by the color of their skin, and we can even justify the content of their character, whether good or bad, based upon the color of their skin. So if people are doing things to bring about the right revolution and the right action, according to critical theorists, they get a pass. Why? Because the goal is to bring about the revolution. So you don't ask, what are they doing? Is what they are doing, is it wrong? You must ask, why are they doing it? And here's the reason why. The why they're doing it is to bring about revolution because they feel oppressed or whatever. So if you have a person, let's just think back to 2020. You have people out looting and burning everything in the streets. It doesn't matter what they're doing, it's why they're doing it. And if you can justify a why for what they're doing, namely critical consciousness plus the theory of praxis, you can give a reason, a justified reason, according to critical theorists, to practically do whatever you want. But that's fundamentally opposed to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement would have been something saying, no, you have to judge what people's actions are actually doing, not just why they're doing something. So if you're out there burning and looting the streets, well, you're doing something that's fundamentally wrong, and it should be called out for being fundamentally wrong. Now, another aspect that you have to see here is that they are fundamentally opposed for this other reason. Namely, critical race theory is elevating the ideas and influence of Marxism over the classical liberal order upon which the Constitution and the basic philosophical and theoretical principles of the civil rights movement were based upon. Communism is fundamentally incompatible with the U.S. Constitution and the notion of the equality before the law and the individual rights of people based as people, not just disparage it, different racial makeups and so on and so forth. Now, another reason is that it's fundamentally opposed because they're making someone's worth based upon their race, not upon the fact that they're made in the image of God or because they are human beings first and foremost who are valuable in and of themselves. Rather, your value, according to this, unfortunately, is based solely and wholly upon your race, not based off of something like you have inherent worth and inherent rights as a human being. Because remember what we said earlier, it's not that you're just a man, it's that you are a black man. Or it's not that you were just a woman, it's that you're a black woman. The whole point is that your race or your gender, depending on what kind of critical theory, critical feminist theory or critical race theory, is more fundamental and axiomatic and essential to who you are than your human nature. Now, here's what's of great interest to me is that, they're always trying to undo so many tenets of Western society. And fundamental to Western society, and in particular metaphysical realism within Western society, is that your essential nature is more important than what's known as an accidental property. So within classical realism, you have something like this. Essential to you would be your humanity, and an accidental property would be something like how tall you are, how much you weigh, positionally, where are you? Were you like to the left of the phone pole, to the right of the phone pole? But included in that would have been accidental features such as color, like the color of my hair. Could it be red, black, whatever? But also skin color. And it's because we realize that there are primary and secondary qualities. Like who I am is not determined like based off of secondary qualities. Who I am is primarily based off of primary qualities or essential qualities. And what they're doing is they're flipping that script in that regard. And in many respects, not only are they anti-racism in that sense, is it a false view? It's actually anti-racism is actually racism, but their whole idea is they're actually flipping the whole script of what's essential to human nature. What's essential to human nature is humanity in and of itself. And the long tradition of Western philosophy, namely what all of Western society has been built upon, is recognizing our worth is found in these essential forms and these essential natures, not secondary properties. And you might be saying, well, okay, but that's what we got to do away with. And I'm just going, well, that's fundamentally what CRT is trying to do, is they're trying to do away with essentialized concepts of natures in that regard, because they're fundamentally antithetical to their theory. And in other videos, we've talked about just this classic metaphysic that's been adopted by both Christians and non-Christians as axiomatic to Western society. And I think we should continue it. So maybe another date, we'll do another video on the necessity of metaphysical realism as it relates to this. But let's continue on here. The next thing that I want you to see is that they're making the entry point into dialogue and any of this through CRT. So if you want to dialogue about it, you must buy into the concepts and to the whole tenets of CRT. Now, have you noticed this? Is that they're fundamentally opposed because one is requiring, in order for the dialogue to even take place about racism, that you must axiomatically buy into critical consciousness. And that's why I keep saying here is that the entry point into conversation is the fact that we have a shared humanity, not because we have a shared critical consciousness. In addition to it, what we find is that they're actually continuing racial differences versus working to overcome them. So if race is the fundamental differentiation between them, what can fundamentally unite us? Well, critical race theory has nothing that can fundamentally unite us, whereas the civil rights movement would say we're made in the image of God. We're all essentially human beings. We're all given inalienable rights. So one is saying you can have all of those, whereas critical race theory is saying none of those things bind. Why? Because the very concepts of inalienable rights and equality before the law and maybe even the image of God are fundamentally white understandings of society, reality, legal discourse, societal discourse, financial discourse, accountability between one another. And what are they? Racist. So what I want you to also say here is that our final section here is that CRT is radically opposed to the civil rights movement because it questions the very pillars of Western society that gave us the civil rights movement, namely the concept of equality, the notion of neutral, legal reasoning, rational thinking and discourse, and neutral principles of the law. In short, Lady Justice is no longer blind. Lady Justice must be racist. And Lady Justice must not give us equality. It must give us equity. It must give us an sort of a general, equitable, everybody meets the exact same at the end outcome. And if that doesn't occur, well, then some disparaging oppression occurred in their life, which, according to critical race theories or theorists, is a form of racism. So with that said, what I want you to fundamentally see is this, is that critical race theory, as we said here, is this notion that racism, that belief that racism that benefits white people, white supremacy. So white supremacy is the fundamental organizing principle of society. That comes from James Lindsay. And that in order to fight this, you must become an anti-racist. In order to become an anti-racist, you must see everything through the lens of critical race theory and put in critical race praxis. And these radically differ with the civil rights movement in that the fundamental organizing principle of all society is not white supremacy. It's the fact that you're made in the image of God and you have inalienable rights given from God. CRT argues that the pillars of Western society, equality, legal reasoning, rational thinking, neutrality before the law, are all fundamentally racist. Whereas the civil rights movement used those very concepts in order to bring about true racial equality within society. So with that said, what I want us to see here is that these two movements are not only not the logical extension from one to the other, namely the CRT is not the logical extension of the civil rights movement. Rather, CRT is the fundamental undermining of the civil rights movement. And we should return, even though all critical race theorists would deny this, to Martin Luther King's whole theory. Namely, we should be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin.